They believed themselves untouchable, until the murder of a human child unleashed wrath. The Galactic Council chamber hummed with the low vibrations of 100 different species, each representative seated according to their worlds, standing in the vast political web that governed known space. At the center of the curved amphitheater, the Zephyrian delegation held court, their crystalline bodies catching and refracting the chamber's soft lighting into rainbow cascades across the polished floors. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire stood tall, his translucent form pulsing with a confident blue glow that indicated complete certainty in his species' superiority. For 300 cycles, the Zephyrians had dominated galactic politics through a combination of advanced technology, economic manipulation, and when necessary, carefully orchestrated violence. Their crystal ships could phase through most defensive barriers, their energy weapons could disrupt matter at the molecular level, and their psychic abilities allowed them to influence the thoughts of weaker species. "The motion before us today," Kethvar announced, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made other species feel compelled to agree, "concerns the continued expansion of Zephyrian protected zones throughout the Outer Rim territories. These regions require our guidance and security, as the primitive species inhabiting them clearly cannot govern themselves effectively." Murmurs of reluctant agreement rippled through the chamber. The Bavari representative, a massive creature with 4 arms and skin like aged leather, shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced seat. The insected Qatari delegate clicked her mandibles nervously, while the aquatic Saren ambassador's tank bubbled with agitation. They all knew what Zephyrian protection really meant: systematic exploitation, resource extraction, and the gradual suppression of any culture that didn't serve their interests. But none dared speak against them. The last species to formally challenge Zephyrian expansion, the proud warrior race known as the Thrakari, had seen their homeworld's population mysteriously reduced by 80% when a solar flare event destroyed their primary cities. Everyone knew it hadn't been natural, but proving Zephyrian involvement was impossible. Their technology operated beyond the understanding of most galactic civilizations. Near the back of the chamber, in one of the smaller seats reserved for newer or less significant species, sat Dr. Elena Vasquez, the sole human representative to the Galactic Council. Humans had achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago, making them relative newcomers to the galactic community. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards, their military weak, their population scattered across barely a dozen worlds in a small cluster they called the Sol system and its immediate neighbors. Elena watched the proceedings with careful attention, taking notes on a simple electronic tablet that looked almost quaint compared to the holographic displays and neural interfaces used by other species. She was a xenobiologist by training, more comfortable studying alien life forms than navigating the treacherous waters of galactic politics. But Earth's government had insisted on maintaining a diplomatic presence despite their minimal influence. "The human delegate seems particularly interested in our discussion," Kethvar observed, his attention turning toward Elena with the predatory focus of a hunter who had spotted easy prey. "Perhaps she would like to share her species' perspective on galactic governance." Elena stood slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of alien gazes upon her. She was a small woman by human standards, barely 5 feet tall, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing the dark blue uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. To most of the assembled representatives, she looked fragile, insignificant, and utterly out of place among beings who could live for centuries and commanded the resources of entire star systems. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak, Ambassador Kethvar," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "Humanity is still learning about galactic civilization, but we believe that true security comes from cooperation and mutual respect, not from domination disguised as protection." A wave of shocked silence swept through the chamber. No one had directly challenged Zephyrian policy in decades, certainly not a representative from such a weak and insignificant species. Kethvar's crystalline form flickered through several colors before settling on an ominous deep purple that indicated both amusement and threat. "How refreshing to hear such naive optimism," he said, his harmonic voice now carrying undertones that made several representatives visibly uncomfortable. "Perhaps when humanity has survived in this galaxy for more than a few decades, they will develop a more realistic understanding of how power truly works. Until then, I suggest they focus on governing their own small corner of space and leave larger matters to species with the wisdom and strength to handle them properly. Alina felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had expected this kind of condescension, had been warned by Earth's intelligence services that the Zephyrians viewed humans as barely above the level of clever animals. What troubled her more was the casual way Kethvar had dismissed not just her words, but the fundamental principles her species held dear. The session continued for several more hours, with various motions being presented and voted upon. In each case, the Zephyrian position prevailed, often without formal opposition. Alina noted which species consistently voted with them and which abstained rather than risk confrontation. The political landscape was becoming clear. The galaxy was divided into the Zephyrian sphere of influence and everyone else, with the latter group too frightened or too dependent to resist. As the session concluded, Alina gathered her simple belongings and prepared to leave. She had accommodations aboard the orbital diplomatic station that serviced the Galactic Council, a small suite of rooms that Earth maintained more out of pride than practical necessity. The human presence here was largely symbolic, a way of announcing to the galaxy that Terrans were a spacefaring species deserving of recognition, even if that recognition came with little actual respect. Dr. Vasquez. The voice belonged to Ambassador Thokmer of the Bavari Confederation, the massive four-armed being who had sat through most of the session in uncomfortable silence. "Might I have a word?" Alina looked up at the imposing figure, nodding the way his leathery hide was marked with scars that spoke of a violent past. The Bavari were known as traders and craftsmen now, but they had once been a formidable warrior culture before coming under Zephyrian influence. "Of course, Ambassador, what can I do for you?" Thokmer glanced around nervously, then gestured toward a small alcove away from the main flow of departing delegates. When they were relatively alone, he leaned down to speak in a low rumble. "Your words today were brave, but also dangerous. The Zephyrians do not tolerate defiance, even symbolic defiance. My people learned this lesson 50 cycles ago when we questioned one of their trade agreements. Within a month, our primary trade routes were mysteriously plagued by pirate attacks that cost us millions in lost cargo." Alina frowned. "You're saying they orchestrated the attacks?" "I'm saying that coincidences follow patterns, Dr. Vasquez, and the patterns around Zephyrian displeasure are remarkably consistent. Species that oppose them find themselves facing unexpected problems. Equipment failures, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, always with plausible explanations that can't be definitively traced back to their technology. And the Galactic Council does nothing." Thokmer's laugh was bitter. "The Council exists at Zephyrian sufferance. Half the member species depend on them for advanced technology, the other half are too afraid to risk their wrath. We maintain the pretense of democratic governance, but everyone knows who really makes the decisions." Alina absorbed this information, feeling a growing sense of unease. Earth's intelligence reports had suggested that the Zephyrians were influential, but the picture Thokmer was painting was far more dire. If they truly controlled galactic civilization through fear and manipulation, then humanity's position was even more precarious than anyone back home realized. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because your species is young and still has hope. Because you spoke truth in that chamber today, even when it would have been safer to remain silent. And because—" he paused, his massive hands clenching and unclenching. "Because I remember what it was like to have pride before we learned to bow our heads and accept whatever scraps the Zephyrians chose to throw us." Before Alina could respond, Thokmer straightened and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing through the chamber. She watched him go, noting how other species seemed to unconsciously move aside to let him pass, as if his very presence reminded them of uncomfortable truths they preferred to ignore. The rest of Alina's journey back to her quarters passed in a blur of alien corridors and transportation tubes. The diplomatic station was a marvel of engineering, built to accommodate dozens of different atmospheric requirements and biological needs. Gravity fields, air composition, temperature, and even time cycles could be adjusted for each species' comfort, creating a truly neutral ground where galactic diplomacy could function. But as Alina settled into her modest, human-standard quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that the neutrality was an illusion. If the Zephyrians truly controlled as much as Thokmer suggested, then this entire station, the Council itself, and the careful protocols of galactic civilization were all just elaborate theater designed to mask their absolute authority. She activated her communication terminal and began composing a report for Earth's government. The process was slow and careful. She knew that all diplomatic communications were monitored by the station's security systems, which meant that anything sensitive had to be coded or implied rather than stated directly. But the message was clear enough for those who knew how to read it. Humanity was walking into a trap that had already snared most of the galaxy. As she worked, Alina found herself thinking about her daughter Sarah, safe back on Earth in the growing colony of New Geneva. The 12-year-old was fascinated by space exploration and alien cultures, constantly asking Alina to send pictures and stories from her diplomatic missions. Alina had always painted an optimistic picture in her messages home, emphasizing the wonders of galactic civilization and the opportunities it might offer for humanity's future. Now she wondered if she had been naive to assume that the galaxy operated according to the same principles of justice and cooperation that humans valued. The universe was vast and old, filled with species that had developed along radically different evolutionary paths. Perhaps the strong dominating the weak was simply the natural order, and humanity's ideals were nothing more than the luxury of a young species that hadn't yet learned hard realities. But as she finished her report and prepared for sleep, Alina made a quiet resolution. Whatever the truth about galactic power structures, she would continue to represent humanity with dignity and integrity. If the galaxy had forgotten what it meant to stand up for principles rather than surrender to convenience, then perhaps it was time for a reminder. She had no way of knowing that thousands of light years away, events were already in motion that would soon test that resolution in ways she could never have imagined. In the outer rim territories that the Zephyrians were so eager to bring under their protection, a small human research station was about to become the focal point of a conflict that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. Dr. Michael Chen, head of the Xenobiology Research Station on Kepler 442c, was facing his own crisis of faith in galactic governance. The planet was officially classified as uninhabited, suitable for human colonization and scientific research under the standard terraforming protocols established by the Council. What those protocols failed to mention was that the world was also rich in crystalline deposits that could be refined into the exotic matter used in Zephyrian phase shift technology. Chen had discovered the deposits 3 months ago during a routine geological survey and had dutifully reported them to both Earth authorities and the Galactic Council as required by law. What he hadn't expected was the swift response from Zephyrian corporate interests, who claimed that the presence of their proprietary technology materials made the planet subject to their exclusive mining rights. The legal challenge was proceeding through official channels, but Chen was beginning to suspect that the outcome had already been decided. Zephyrian law enforcement ships had begun conducting routine patrols in the system, their crystalline hulls visible to anyone who looked up at the night sky. Trade ships that had previously brought supplies to the research station were suddenly finding excuses to avoid the system, citing security concerns and insurance complications. Most troubling of all were the accidents, equipment failures that shouldn't have been possible with modern technology, communication disruptions that followed no recognizable pattern, and yesterday, the atmospheric processor that maintained breathable air for the station's human staff had developed a critical fault that nearly resulted in catastrophic decompression. Chen's team had managed to repair the damage, but the incident had shaken everyone's confidence. The processor had been inspected just 2 weeks ago and found to be in perfect condition. For it to suddenly develop multiple simultaneous failures suggested either impossibly bad luck or deliberate sabotage. But how could anyone sabotage equipment that was monitored 24 hours a day by automated systems? How could failures occur without leaving any trace of external interference? The technology to accomplish such feats was beyond human understanding, which made Chen suspect that it was also beyond the understanding of most other galactic species. All except one. As Chen stood in his laboratory, watching his daughter Sarah play with the station's maintenance robots through the transparent aluminum window, he tried to push away the growing sense of dread that had been building for weeks. Sarah was spending the summer with him as part of an educational exchange program, eager to see alien life forms and experience the wonders of space exploration that her mother had described in her letters from the Galactic Council. The 12-year-old had adapted to station life with the resilience of youth, making friends with the adult staff and even learning basic maintenance procedures from the engineers. Her enthusiasm and curiosity had brought a touch of lightness to what was becoming an increasingly tense situation, reminding everyone why humanity had reached for the stars in the first place. But now, watching her laugh as one of the robots performed a clumsy dance at her request, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake in bringing her here. The station was becoming a pressure cooker, with forces beyond human control slowly tightening around them. And if his suspicions about the accidents were correct, then Sarah was in more danger than anyone realized. The communication terminal chimed, indicating an incoming transmission from the council station. Chen activated the display, expecting another routine bureaucratic update about the legal proceedings. Instead, he found himself looking at the concerned face of Dr. Elena Vasquez, his ex-wife and Sarah's mother. "Michael, I need you to listen carefully," Elena said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "I can't give you details over this channel, but I have reason to believe that your situation on Kepler 442c is more dangerous than we initially thought. The Zephyrians are not going to accept any legal ruling that goes against their interests, and they have ways of ensuring that such rulings never happen." Chen felt his blood run cold. Elena's diplomatic training had taught her to speak in careful euphemisms, but the message was clear enough. The legal process was a sham, and the Zephyrians were already moving to take control of the planet through other means. "What are you recommending?" he asked, glancing toward the window where Sarah was still playing with the robots. "Pack only what you absolutely need and prepare for immediate evacuation. I'm trying to arrange transport, but it may take several days. In the meantime, keep your staff together and avoid any unnecessary risks. And Michael," Elena paused, her expression growing even more serious, "watch Sarah carefully. Don't let her out of your sight." The transmission ended, leaving Chen staring at the blank screen with a growing sense of panic. Elena wouldn't have sent such a warning unless she believed the threat was immediate and severe. But evacuation wasn't simple when you were dealing with 37 people, critical research equipment, and a transport infrastructure that was increasingly unreliable. Worse, Chen realized that Elena's warning might have come too late. The Zephyrian patrol ships had been increasing their presence in the system for weeks, and any attempt to evacuate would be easily detected and potentially intercepted. If they were truly determined to seize control of the planet, they might not allow any human witnesses to leave alive. As if summoned by his dark thoughts, the station's proximity alarms began to sound. Chen rushed to the main display, his heart sinking as he saw what the sensors had detected. 3 Zephyrian enforcement vessels were approaching at high speed, their crystalline hulls pulsing with the energy signatures that indicated full battle readiness. Behind him, Sarah had stopped playing and was looking toward the adults with the intuitive concern of a child who sensed that something was wrong. Chen forced himself to smile reassuringly as he activated the station's general communication system. "Attention all personnel," he announced, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We have incoming visitors. Please follow standard protocols and report to your designated stations. This is not a drill." As his staff began the familiar routine of preparing for an official inspection, Chen couldn't help but wonder if they were actually preparing for something far worse. The Zephyrians had spent centuries perfecting the art of making problems disappear without leaving evidence of their involvement. And 37 humans on an isolated research station would be a very easy problem to solve. They believed themselves untouchable until the murder of a human child unleashed wrath. The Zephyrian enforcement vessels descended through Kepler 442c's atmosphere like deadly crystalline meteors, their translucent hulls refracting the system's orange star into brilliant displays of light that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Dr. Michael Chen watched their approach from the research station's command center, noting how their formation suggested this was not a routine inspection, but a military operation disguised as one. "Sir," called Lieutenant Torres from the communications station, her voice tight with concern. "They're broadcasting on emergency frequencies, claiming authority to conduct an immediate compliance audit under Galactic Security Protocol 77 Alpha." Chen frowned. He had never heard of that particular protocol, which was suspicious given his extensive training in galactic law and regulations. But then again, The Zephyrians had a talent for creating new legal justifications whenever their existing ones proved insufficient. Acknowledge their transmission and request specific details about the nature of this audit, he ordered. And Tours, start recording everything. I want a complete record of this encounter. The lead Zephyrian vessel touched down in the station's main landing bay with barely a whisper of displaced air, its advanced systems automatically adjusting to local atmospheric conditions. Chen could see movement through the crystalline hull as figures prepared to disembark, their forms distorted by the ship's refractive properties, but unmistakably humanoid. "Daddy," Sarah's voice came from behind him, small and uncertain. She had been helping in the laboratory when the alarm sounded, and now stood in the doorway of the command center with her arms wrapped around herself. "Are the visitors here to see our research?" Chen turned to his daughter, forcing another reassuring smile despite the knot of fear in his stomach. "They're just here for an inspection, sweetheart. Why don't you go to your room and work on that report about the local ecosystem? I'll come check on you in a little while." Sarah nodded but didn't move, her 12-year-old instincts clearly picking up on the tension that filled the command center. Chen made a mental note to have one of his most trusted staff members stay with her, just in case Alina's warnings proved more prescient than he hoped. The main entrance to the research station hissed open, and 3 Zephyrian figures strode through with the confident bearing of beings accustomed to immediate obedience. Their leader was tall even by their species' standards, his crystalline body pulsing with the deep purple glow that indicated high rank and absolute authority. Behind him came 2 subordinates, their forms slightly smaller but radiating the same sense of dangerous capability. "I am Commander Velter of the Zephyrian Enforcement Division," the leader announced, his harmonic voice carrying undertones that made several of Chen's staff members step backward involuntarily. "This facility has been flagged for immediate inspection under emergency security protocols. All personnel will cooperate fully or face charges of obstructing galactic justice." Chen stepped forward, drawing on years of diplomatic training to maintain his composure. "Welcome to Research Station Kepler 442C, Commander. I'm Dr. Michael Chen, Facility Director. We're happy to cooperate with any lawful inspection, but I'll need to see specific authorization codes and a detailed explanation of the charges that have prompted this action." Velter's crystalline features shifted through several colors before settling on an ominous dark red. "You presume to question Zephyrian authority, human? Your species' ignorance of proper protocols is becoming tiresome. The authorization is my presence here, and the charges are whatever violations we discover during our inspection." The casual arrogance in the commander's voice made Chen's jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain diplomatic. "I understand your position, Commander, but I have responsibilities to my staff and to the scientific integrity of our research. If you could just provide the standard documentation." "The time for documentation has passed," Velter interrupted, gesturing to his subordinates. "Begin the inspection. Pay particular attention to their communication logs, research data, and any materials that might constitute unauthorized resource extraction." Chen felt a chill run down his spine. The Zephyrians weren't here for a routine inspection. They were here to gather intelligence and possibly plant evidence that would justify seizing control of the station. His mind raced through the possibilities, trying to find some legal avenue that might protect his people. "Commander, I must protest. Under Galactic Law Article 15, any species has the right to legal representation during enforcement actions that might result in criminal charges. I demand the opportunity to contact Earth's diplomatic mission." "Your protests are noted and dismissed," Velter replied coldly. "This is a matter of galactic security, which supersedes normal diplomatic protections. Your government will be notified of the outcome once our investigation is complete." As the Zephyrian subordinates spread out through the station, Chen realized that Alina's warnings had been understated, if anything. This wasn't just about the crystalline deposits. This was about eliminating any human presence that might interfere with Zephyrian interests in the sector. The legal challenge over mining rights had simply provided a convenient excuse to move against the station. "Sir," Tours whispered urgently from her position at the communications console, "I'm detecting some kind of interference with our long-range transmitters. We can still receive messages, but outgoing signals are being suppressed." Chen nodded grimly. Of course they would cut off outside communications first. standard procedure for any operation where witnesses might prove inconvenient. He watched as the Zephyrian officers moved through his station with practiced efficiency, their advanced sensors no doubt recording every detail of the facility's layout and capabilities. Dr. Chen, Commander Velter's voice carried a note of false concern. It has come to our attention that you have unauthorized personnel aboard this station, specifically a minor child who should not be present in a potentially hazardous research environment. The blood in Chen's veins turned to ice. They knew about Sarah. Of course they knew their intelligence gathering was probably more thorough than anything humans could imagine. But why would they single her out unless? My daughter is here as part of an approved educational exchange program, Chen replied carefully. All proper documentation was filed with both Earth authorities and the Galactic Council. Documentation that may have been forged or obtained under false pretenses, Velter said, his harmonic voice now carrying undertones that suggested he was enjoying this conversation. The child represents a security risk and must be placed in protective custody pending further investigation. Absolutely not. The words came out harder than Chen had intended, his parental instincts overriding diplomatic caution. Sarah is under my protection and care. You have no authority to detain a human child without specific charges and proper legal process. Velter's crystalline form pulsed with amused malice. How touching. Human parental bonds are remarkably strong, considering how brief your lifespans are. But you misunderstand the situation, Dr. Chen. We are not requesting custody of the child. We are informing you that she is now under Zephyrian jurisdiction for her own safety. Before Chen could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Not the proximity alerts that had announced the Zephyrian arrival, but the emergency klaxons that indicated a critical system failure. Chen's training took over as he rushed to the nearest status display, his blood chilling as he read the scrolling warnings. Atmospheric containment breach in Section 7, he called out to his staff. Primary life support is showing cascade failures across multiple systems. How unfortunate, Commander Velter observed with obvious satisfaction. It appears that your facility suffers from serious maintenance deficiencies. Clearly, this is not a safe environment for a human child. My subordinates will escort her to our ship for immediate evacuation while we investigate these dangerous conditions. Chen spun around to face the Zephyrian commander, fury and fear warring in his chest. Those systems were inspected 2 weeks ago. They were in perfect condition. You did this. Such serious accusations require evidence, Dr. Chen. Do you have any proof that Zephyrian personnel were responsible for your equipment failures? Any sensor readings that show external interference? Any witnesses who observed sabotage taking place? The commander's tone was mocking, clearly confident that no such evidence existed. And of course it didn't. Zephyrian technology was far too sophisticated to leave traces that human sensors could detect. They could probably disintegrate the entire station and make it look like a reactor accident. The child, Dr. Chen, Velter continued. Where is she? My officers are prepared to search every compartment if necessary, but cooperation would be appreciated. Chen's mind raced through desperate possibilities. The station's emergency protocols called for evacuation to the underground shelters in case of atmospheric failure, but those shelters wouldn't protect Sarah from the Zephyrians. His staff was brave, but completely outmatched by beings whose technology bordered on the supernatural. And even if they could somehow resist, what then? They were alone on an isolated planet with no hope of rescue. Daddy, Sarah's voice cut through the chaos as she ran into the command center, her face pale with fear. Something's wrong with the air recyclers. Dr. Patel sent me to find you. Chen's heart broke as he saw his daughter's trusting expression. She still believed that adults could fix any problem, that her father could protect her from any danger. She had no way of understanding that they were facing enemies who operated by rules that humans could barely comprehend. It's going to be okay, sweetheart, he lied, kneeling down to her level. These officers are here to help with the emergency. They want to make sure you're safe. How considerate, Velter said, his harmonic voice shifting to tones that most species found soothing, but that made Chen's skin crawl. Hello, young Sarah. I am Commander Velter. We're going to take you somewhere much safer until your father can fix all these dangerous problems. Sarah looked between her father and the towering crystalline figure, her natural childhood curiosity warring with an instinctive sense that something was very wrong. "But I want to stay with Daddy. Can't he come too?" "I'm afraid your father has important work to do here," Velter replied, his form pulsing with colors that seemed designed to mesmerize and calm. "But don't worry. We have wonderful facilities aboard our ship, with games and stories from across the galaxy. You'll have such interesting experiences to tell him about when you return." The way he said, "when you return," sent ice through Chen's veins. The Zephyrian commander wasn't even pretending that this was a temporary arrangement. They were taking Sarah, and they had no intention of giving her back. The only question was what they planned to do with her and with the rest of the station personnel. "I won't let you take her," Chen said quietly, standing and moving protectively between his daughter and the Zephyrian officers. "I don't care about your authority or your protocols. She's my child and she's under my protection." "How admirable," Velter observed. "Human devotion to offspring is truly remarkable, even when it becomes counterproductive. But consider your position, Dr. Chen. Your station is failing, your staff is in danger, and you are completely outmatched by beings whose capabilities you cannot even comprehend. Surely the rational choice is to ensure your child's safety rather than risk her life for the sake of principle." Behind Chen, he could hear his staff working frantically to stabilize the failing life support systems, their voices tight with fear and frustration. The damage was clearly beyond their ability to repair quickly, which meant that staying in the station was indeed becoming dangerous for everyone. But Chen knew that the danger from the failing systems was nothing compared to the danger from their supposed rescuers. The Zephyrians had orchestrated this entire crisis to force exactly this choice: surrender the child voluntarily or watch her die, along with everyone else, when the station's life support finally collapsed completely. "There is another option," Commander Velter said softly, as if reading Chen's thoughts. "Your research data suggests that you've made significant discoveries about this planet's crystalline formations, information that could be valuable to certain interests. Perhaps we could reach an understanding that benefits everyone." The offer hung in the air like poison. Chen realized that this had been the plan all along: create a crisis that forced him to choose between his daughter's life and his scientific integrity. The Zephyrians wanted both the planet and the research data, but they preferred to acquire them through coercion rather than open theft. "What kind of understanding?" Chen asked, hatting himself for even considering the option. "Your daughter remains safely aboard our vessel while you and your staff complete your research under our guidance. When the work is finished to our satisfaction, she is returned to you, and your team is relocated to a comfortable facility where you can continue your scientific careers under Zephyrian sponsorship. Everyone survives, everyone prospers, everyone finds a place in the new galactic order we are creating." Sarah tugged at Chen's sleeve, her young voice cutting through the tension. "Daddy, I don't want to go with them. They feel wrong." Out of the mouths of babes, Chen thought bitterly. His 12-year-old daughter had identified something that took adults years of political experience to recognize: the fundamental wrongness of beings who viewed other species as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. But what choice did he have? The station was dying around them, his staff was helpless against Zephyrian technology, and any resistance would only result in everyone's death. At least if he cooperated, Sarah might survive long enough for some kind of rescue to arrive. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope he had. "I need guarantees," Chen said finally. "Written agreements about her treatment, regular communication, specific timelines for completion of the research. I won't hand her over based on promises alone." Commander Velter's crystalline form flickered through several colors before settling on a satisfied blue. "Of course. We are not barbarians, Dr. Chen. Proper documentation will be provided, though I should mention that such agreements are subject to renegotiation based on changing circumstances." Chen closed his eyes, feeling the weight of defeat settle over him like a suffocating blanket. He was about to hand his daughter over to beings who might as well have been demons from humanity's darkest myths. But the alternative was watching her die in agony as the station's atmosphere slowly became unbreathable. "All right," he whispered, "but I want to accompany her to your ship at least initially. I need to see where she'll be staying." "Naturally," Velter agreed. "Parental concern is understandable, even when it serves no practical purpose." As Chen knelt down to explain the situation to Sarah in terms she could understand, he found himself thinking about Alina's warnings. His ex-wife had tried to tell him that the Zephyrians were more dangerous than anyone realized, that they had ways of eliminating problems without leaving evidence. Now he was living proof of their methods. They didn't need to destroy their enemies when they could simply force them to destroy themselves. But what neither Chen nor Velter realized was that this moment, this choice between a father's love and impossible circumstances, was being recorded by systems that operated beyond Zephyrian detection. Deep in the station's quantum communication array, an experimental human AI was documenting everything, preparing to transmit a message that would travel faster than light itself. The Zephyrians believed themselves untouchable because they controlled the visible mechanisms of galactic power. But they had underestimated humanity's talent for adaptation and innovation. More importantly, they had underestimated the fury that would follow when their carefully hidden cruelties were finally dragged into the light. Sarah Chen was about to become the spark that would ignite a war the galaxy had never seen. And her father's anguish would become the catalyst for humanity's transformation from naive newcomers into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. They believed themselves untouchable until the murder of a human child unleashed wrath. The Zephyrian enforcement vessel's interior was a masterpiece of crystalline engineering, its walls pulsing with soft bioluminescent patterns that responded to the emotional states of its occupants. Dr. Michael Chen found himself surrounded by beauty that felt malevolent, like being trapped inside a predator's digestive system that happened to be decorated with jewels. Sarah walked close beside him, her small hand gripping his tightly as they were escorted through corridors that defied human understanding of physics. The floors seemed solid but gave slightly underfoot, adjusting to each step with an organic responsiveness that suggested the ship was more grown than built. The air carried sense that human olfactory systems couldn't quite categorize, not unpleasant, but alien in a way that triggered deep evolutionary warnings about dangerous environments. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Commander Velter observed, his harmonic voice carrying notes of genuine pride. "This vessel represents 1,200 cycles of technological advancement. Your species builds crude metal shells and calls them starships. We grow our vessels from crystalline matrices that think and adapt. The difference is instructive." Chen forced himself to remain silent, though the casual arrogance in the commander's voice made his jaw clench. They passed through what appeared to be common areas where other Zephyrian crew members paused in their activities to observe the humans with expressions that ranged from curious to contemptuous. Chen noted that despite their crystal bodies, they still followed recognizable social hierarchies. Lower-ranking individuals stepped aside for those of higher status, and all showed immediate deference to Velter. "Here we are," the commander announced as they stopped before a section of wall that suddenly iris opened to reveal a spacious chamber beyond. The child's quarters for the duration of her stay. Chen stepped inside and felt his heart sink. The room was beautiful by alien standards, walls that shifted through pleasing color patterns, furniture that molded itself to accommodate human physiology, environmental controls that automatically adjusted temperature and humidity to optimal levels. It was also unmistakably a prison, with no visible exits other than the iris door they had entered through and no windows or communication equipment that might allow contact with the outside world. "It's like being inside a rainbow," Sarah whispered, her 12-year-old wonder temporarily overcoming her fear as she watched the walls cycle through different hues. "But Daddy, how do I get out to use the bathroom?" "All biological needs are automatically accommodated," Velter explained with the patient tone adults used when explaining simple concepts to children. "The chamber's sensors monitor your requirements and provide appropriate facilities as needed. You need never leave this space during your visit." The implications of that statement hit Chen like a physical blow. They weren't planning to let Sarah out of this room at all. She would be kept in luxurious isolation, completely dependent on her captors for every basic need. It was sophisticated psychological warfare disguised as hospitality. "I want to stay with my daddy," Sarah said suddenly, moving closer to Chen and wrapping her arms around his waist. "This place is pretty, but it feels lonely." "Loneliness is a temporary condition," Velter replied, his crystalline form shifting to colors that most species found soothing. "We have extensive entertainment libraries containing stories and games from thousands of different cultures. You'll have access to educational materials that will expand your understanding of the galaxy far beyond what any human institution could provide." Chen knelt down to Sarah's level, trying to find words that would prepare her for what was coming without terrifying her completely. "Sweetheart, I need you to be very brave for a little while. These officers need to keep you safe while I finish some important work back at the station. I promise I'll come back for you as soon as I can." "But when?" Sarah asked, her voice small and scared. "How long do I have to stay here?" "Not long," Chen lied, hatting himself for the deception but unable to tell a 12-year-old that he had no idea if he would ever see her again. "Just think of it as, like when you went to summer camp last year. Remember how scared you were at first, but then you made friends and learned new things." Sarah nodded slowly, though her expression remained uncertain. "Will you come visit me? Can I call you on the comm system?" "Communication with the station will be restricted during the investigation," Velter interjected smoothly. "For security reasons, you understand, but your father will be informed regularly of your well-being." Chen felt rage building in his chest at the casual way the Zephyrian commander dismissed his daughter's needs, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper now would only make things worse for Sarah. He had to trust that somewhere in humanity's growing presence in the galaxy, someone would notice what was happening and take action. "I love you, sweetheart," he told Sarah, pulling her into a fierce hug. "Remember that no matter what happens, no matter how scared you get, Mommy and I love you more than all the stars in the sky, and we're going to find a way to bring you home." "I love you too, Daddy," Sarah whispered against his chest. "Tell the maintenance robots I said goodbye, and tell Dr. Patel that I finished the ecosystem report she wanted." The innocence in her voice, the way she was still thinking about homework and robot friends while being held captive by alien beings, nearly broke Chen's composure entirely. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and trying to memorize every detail of this moment. "Time to go, Dr. Chen," Velter announced. "Your staff will be concerned about your extended absence, and there is much work to be done." Chen stood slowly, every parental instinct screaming at him to grab Sarah and run. But where could they go? They were aboard an alien vessel surrounded by beings whose technology made resistance futile. Any attempt to fight would only result in both of them being subdued, and Sarah might be hurt in the process. "Be brave, little star," he told her, using the pet name he had called her since she was a baby. "I'll see you soon." As the iris door closed behind them, Chen heard Sarah call out one last time, "Daddy, I love you." The sound was cut off abruptly as the crystalline barrier sealed shut, leaving only silence and the soft pulse of bioluminescent patterns along the corridor walls. The journey back to the research station passed in a blur of suppressed fury and helpless desperation. Chen tried to engage Velter in conversation about the terms of their agreement, but the commander seemed to have lost interest in maintaining diplomatic pretenses now that the child was secured. "Your cooperation has been noted and appreciated," Velter said as they approached the station's docking bay. "Complete your research efficiently, provide us with all relevant data, and your daughter will remain comfortable and unharmed. Attempt any deception or resistance, and her situation may become less pleasant." The threat was delivered in the same harmonic tones the commander had used for everything else, but Chen heard the steel underneath. These beings had perfected the art of violence through psychological pressure, making their victims complicit in their own destruction while maintaining plausible deniability about their methods. Chen returned to find his staff working frantically to repair the life support failures that had provided the excuse for Sarah's protective custody. Dr. Patel, the station's chief engineer, looked up from her diagnostic displays with exhausted relief. "Michael, thank God you're back. We've managed to stabilize the primary systems, but it was touch and go for a while. I've never seen cascading failures like these. It's almost like the equipment was programmed to self-destruct." "Where's Sarah?" asked Dr. Martinez, the xenobiology specialist who had been mentoring the girl's interest in alien ecosystems. "Is she okay? Some of the crew said they saw her leave with the Zephyrian officers." Chen closed his eyes, feeling the weight of leadership and fatherhood crushing down on him. His staff was looking to him for answers, for reassurance, for some sign that their world wasn't falling apart around them. But how could he explain that they were all pawns in a game whose rules they didn't understand, played by beings who viewed their lives as nothing more than statistical variables? "Sarah is being held aboard their vessel for her safety," he said finally. The Zephyrians are concerned about the station's structural integrity and want to ensure no harm comes to civilian personnel. The lie tasted like poison in his mouth, but what else could he say? That his daughter was a hostage, that they were all prisoners disguised as research partners, that their carefully planned mission to study alien life had become a nightmare of political manipulation and technological intimidation. "Sir," Lieutenant Torres called from her communications station. "I'm picking up a priority transmission from Earth. It's from your wife, Dr. Vasquez. She says it's urgent." Chen felt a flicker of hope. Alina had warned him about Zephyrian methods before this crisis began, which suggested she had access to intelligence sources that might offer some kind of assistance. He activated his personal communication terminal, noting that the Zephyrian officers who had remained aboard the station made no attempt to prevent the conversation. Alina's face appeared on the screen, her expression grim with controlled fear. "Michael, I've been monitoring the situation through official channels. The Council has been informed that your station experienced critical failures and that Zephyrian forces responded to provide emergency assistance. Where is Sarah?" Chen glanced at the nearest Zephyrian officer, a subordinate who was pretending to examine research equipment while obviously monitoring their conversation. "She's being kept safe aboard their vessel until we can resolve the technical problems here." Alina's diplomatic training allowed her to read between the lines immediately. "I see. Michael, I need you to listen very carefully. There have been developments here that change the nature of our situation. I can't give you details over this channel, but help is coming. You need to hold on and protect your people until it arrives." "What kind of help?" Chen asked, though he already suspected that Alina couldn't answer that question directly. "The kind that doesn't follow normal diplomatic channels," she replied cryptically. "The kind that operates outside the usual constraints of galactic law. Just, please be careful, and tell Sarah that Mommy loves her and will see her soon." The transmission ended, leaving Chen staring at the blank screen with a mixture of hope and confusion. Alina seemed to believe that some kind of rescue was possible, but what could Earth's limited military do against Zephyrian technology? Their entire space force consisted of converted mining ships and scientific vessels, brave cruise flying machines that were centuries behind their opponents in every measurable category. "Dr. Chen," called the Zephyrian officer who had been monitoring their conversation, "you will now provide us with complete access to your research data regarding the crystalline formations on this planet. Commander Velter has instructed me to inform you that your cooperation will be evaluated based on the comprehensiveness of this information." Chen nodded slowly, recognizing the implicit threat. Sarah's continued well-being depended on his willingness to hand over research that had taken years to compile. But as he moved toward the data storage systems, a part of his mind was working furiously on the problem Alina had presented. What kind of help could operate outside normal diplomatic channels? What resources did humanity possess that might actually threaten beings who could manipulate matter at the molecular level? And why did Alina sound so confident that rescue was coming when every logical analysis suggested that resistance was futile? The answer, he realized, might lie in the one area where humans had consistently surprised the galactic community: their talent for innovation and adaptation. While other species refined existing technologies over centuries or millennia, humans had a disturbing tendency to invent completely new approaches to old problems. More importantly, they had a talent for escalation that other species found both fascinating and terrifying. When faced with a superior enemy, most civilizations sought accommodation or surrender. Humans, on the other hand, had a history of turning their backs to the wall and fighting with whatever weapons they could improvise. Chen began transferring his research data to the Zephyrian systems, but as he did so, he activated several hidden subroutines in the station's quantum communication array. If Alina was right about help coming from outside normal channels, then she would need detailed intelligence about Zephyrian capabilities and intentions. And if she was wrong, well, at least someone would know what had really happened to Research Station Kepler 442c and the 37 humans who had tried to push back against an empire that had forgotten what it meant to be challenged. Far above the planet's surface, aboard the Zephyrian command vessel, Sarah Chen sat in her beautiful prison and did something that her captors hadn't expected. She began to observe and learn, applying the scientific training her parents had given her to the study of her alien environment. The 12-year-old girl had no way of knowing that her quiet courage and intellectual curiosity were being recorded by hidden systems that would soon broadcast her image across human space. She couldn't know that her fate would become the rallying cry for a species that had spent 50 years trying to find their place in a galaxy that seemed determined to keep them in their place. But somewhere in the depths of space, engines were already burning as ships changed course and weapon systems came online. The Zephyrians had made a critical error in their calculations. They had assumed that humanity would respond to threats the same way other species did, with fear, submission, and acceptance of the natural order. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. They believed themselves untouchable, until the murder of a human child unleashed wrath. Admiral Sarah Mitchell stood in the command center of the battleship Indomitable, watching through the reinforced viewport as Earth's hastily assembled strike force dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. Around her, 23 ships that had never been designed for combat hung in the darkness like predatory angels, their hulls bristling with weapons that had been installed in the past 72 hours. The fleet was an oddity by galactic standards: converted mining vessels, scientific research ships, and cargo haulers that had been transformed into instruments of war through human ingenuity and desperation. What they lacked in elegant design, they made up for in raw destructive potential and the grim determination of crews who had volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission. "Admiral," called Commander Torres from the communications station, "we're receiving quantum burst transmissions from the research station. Dr. Chen has been providing updates on Zephyrian force disposition and capabilities." Mitchell nodded, her weathered face grim with controlled fury. The intelligence reports had been arriving steadily for the past 3 days, each one painting a clearer picture of humanity's first encounter with truly malevolent galactic powers. The Zephyrians weren't just taking hostages or seizing territory, they were demonstrating their ability to destroy human lives with casual indifference, secure in the knowledge that no retaliation was possible. They were about to learn otherwise. "Status report from all vessels," Mitchell ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years commanding mining operations in the asteroid belt before being called upon to lead humanity's first military fleet. "Hercules reporting ready," came the first response. "Weapon systems online, crew at battle stations." "Prometheus standing by. Modified fusion charges armed and ready." "Darwin ready for combat. Scientific payloads converted to kinetic penetrators." One by one, the converted ships reported their readiness for a battle that would either establish humanity as a force to be respected in galactic affairs or demonstrate their complete helplessness against superior technology. Mitchell listened to each report, feeling the weight of decision that had brought them to this moment. The crisis had begun 4 days ago when Dr. Elena Vasquez transmitted an emergency message to Earth's government using diplomatic codes reserved for imminent threats to human survival. Her report painted a picture of systematic Zephyrian aggression disguised as legal proceedings, culminating in the hostage-taking of a 12-year-old girl and the effective occupation of a human research station. The Galactic Council had refused to intervene, citing jurisdictional complexities and the need for thorough investigation before taking any action. Several member species had privately expressed sympathy for humanity's position, but none were willing to risk Zephyrian retaliation by offering more than moral support. Earth's government had faced an impossible choice: accept the loss of research station Kepler 442c and its 37 personnel as the price of avoiding a larger conflict, or take military action that would almost certainly result in humanity being branded as aggressors and facing economic sanctions or worse. The decision had been made when a second transmission arrived from the station, this one showing video footage of Sarah Chen in her crystalline prison. The 12-year-old had been recorded asking her captors when she could see her father again, her voice small and frightened despite her attempts to be brave. The Zephyrian response had been a lesson in psychological warfare disguised as kindness. Explanations about security requirements and investigation procedures delivered in harmonic tones that made their cruelty seem reasonable. But it was the third transmission that had sealed the fleet's fate. 24 hours after Sarah's capture, the station had received word that she had suffered an accident during her detention. According to Commander Velter, The child had attempted to access areas of the ship that were inappropriate for her species' physiology, resulting in exposure to energy fields that had caused irreversible cellular damage. Sarah Chen had died alone, far from her parents, in agony that could have been prevented if the Zephyrians had simply allowed her to remain with her father. Her death had been reported to the Galactic Council as an unfortunate incident arising from human ignorance of proper safety protocols aboard advanced vessels. Dr. Michael Chen's response had been transmitted throughout human space within hours. The recording showed a broken man demanding justice for his daughter's murder, only to be told by Commander Velter that the incident was closed and that continued protests would result in similar accidents befalling other station personnel. The response from Earth had been swift and unprecedented. Every military vessel, converted cargo ship, and armed civilian craft that could be spared had been hastily assembled into a strike force with a single mission: demonstrate to the galaxy that humans could not be murdered with impunity, regardless of the political consequences. "Admiral," Commander Torres announced, "we're receiving a transmission from the Zephyrian command vessel. They're demanding that we leave the system immediately or face destruction for violating galactic territorial sovereignty." Mitchell's expression didn't change. "Put them through." The main display activated, showing the crystalline features of a being she recognized from intelligence briefings as Subcommander Kalathek, Velter's second in command. The Zephyrian's form pulsed with the deep purple glow that indicated absolute confidence in his species' superiority. "Unknown human vessels, you are in violation of Zephyrian-protected space and galactic law. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences of your aggression." "This is Admiral Sarah Mitchell of the Terran Defense Fleet," she replied, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her chest. "We are here to retrieve our citizens and seek justice for the murder of a human child. Surrender the individuals responsible for Sarah Chen's death and release all human personnel, and we will withdraw peacefully." Kalathek's crystalline features shifted through several colors before settling on what Mitchell's briefings had identified as contemptuous amusement. "You speak of murder, but we see only the tragic result of human incompetence and ignorance. The child's death was regrettable but unavoidable, and your crude threats will not change that reality." "Sarah Chen was 12 years old," Mitchell continued, her voice growing harder with each word. "She was murdered by beings who could have protected her but chose instead to use her death as a demonstration of power. That ends now." "How amusing," Kalathek observed. "A collection of converted mining ships believes it can threaten the Zephyrian Empire. Your species' capacity for self-delusion is remarkable, but it will not protect you from the consequences of your actions. Final warning: withdraw or be destroyed." Mitchell closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of her own grandchildren safe on Earth, and of a 12-year-old girl who would never see her parents again. When she opened them, her expression carried the cold fury of a species that had spent millennia learning how to fight against impossible odds. "Message to all ships," she announced. "You know your targets. You know what we're here to do. For Sarah Chen, for every human who will never have to bow down to bullies who think their technology makes them gods. Fire at will." The response was immediate and devastating. 23 converted civilian vessels opened fire simultaneously, their improvised weapon systems unleashing torrents of energy and kinetic projectiles that no galactic military had ever encountered. Fusion charges originally designed for asteroid mining detonated against crystalline hulls with the force of miniature stars. Particle beams meant for cutting through solid rock tore through energy shields that had never been tested against such crude but effective weapons. The Zephyrian ships, magnificent examples of advanced engineering, found themselves facing an enemy that ignored the established rules of space warfare. Where galactic militaries relied on elegant energy weapons and sophisticated defensive systems, the humans had brought brute force and an engineer's understanding of how to break things that were supposedly unbreakable. "Direct hit on the command vessel," Torres reported, her voice tight with concentration. "Their main engines are venting plasma, secondary explosions across their port quarter." Mitchell watched the tactical display with professional satisfaction. The human fleet was taking damage. Several ships showed significant hull breaches and system failures, but they were giving far more than they received. The Zephyrians had been caught completely off guard by humanity's willingness to engage in what was essentially a technological brawl. Admiral, the communications officer's voice carried a note of alarm. I'm receiving multiple transmissions from the research station. Dr. Chen reports that the Zephyrian ground forces are executing hostages in retaliation for our attack. Mitchell felt ice flow through her veins. This was the scenario Earth's strategists had feared most, that any military action would result in the deaths of the very people they were trying to save. But the alternative had been to accept that humans could be murdered without consequence, effectively inviting future atrocities. Continue the attack, she ordered, hatting herself for the decision but knowing it was the only choice available. Signal all ships to focus fire on the ground installations. We end this now. The battle raged for another 17 minutes. 17 minutes that would be remembered in human history, as the moment their species announced its presence to the galaxy in terms that could not be ignored or dismissed. When the last Zephyrian vessel was reduced to drifting wreckage, 23 battered human ships held position around a planet where 36 people had died rather than submit to alien tyranny. The research station had been destroyed in the final moments of the battle, taking with it Dr. Michael Chen and the rest of his staff. Their last transmission had been a message of defiance broadcast across all frequencies. We are human. We do not bow, we do not forget, and we do not forgive. Admiral Mitchell stood in the command center of her damaged flagship, surrounded by the wreckage of humanity's first military victory and first military tragedy. They had proven that humans could fight and win against supposedly superior enemies, but the cost had been the lives of everyone they had come to save. The implications would echo across the galaxy for years to come. Word of the battle spread through interstellar communication networks with unprecedented speed, carrying news that a new species had emerged from the Outer Rim territories with the will and capability to challenge the established order. The Zephyrian Empire, shocked by the loss of an entire enforcement squadron to what they had considered primitive barbarians, began reassessing their expansion plans and their assumptions about human military potential. Other species watched nervously as they realized that the galaxy's newest members were not the peaceful explorers they had appeared to be. But the most significant impact was felt on Earth, where the images of Sarah Chen's crystalline prison and her father's anguished demands for justice became the foundation of a new human doctrine. Never again would their people be considered acceptable casualties in galactic politics, and never again would the death of a human child go unanswered. The Zephyrians had believed themselves untouchable because they controlled superior technology and had never faced serious resistance. They learned, too late, that there were some lines that should never be crossed and some species that would burn the galaxy down rather than accept injustice. Humanity had found their place in galactic civilization, and it was not as supplicants or junior partners. They had announced themselves as a force that would reshape the balance of power through the simple principle that human lives mattered, regardless of who disagreed with that assessment. The war that would follow would be remembered as the turning point when the galaxy learned what happened when humanity's children were threatened. And every species would have to decide which side they wanted to be on when the shooting started in earnest. They believed themselves untouchable, until the murder of a human child unleashed wrath. 3 years after the Battle of Kepler 442c, Ambassador Thokmer of the Bavari Confederation stood in the same Galactic Council chamber where he had once warned Dr. Elena Vasquez about the dangers of opposing Zephyrian power. Now, as he watched the proceedings with a mixture of amazement and apprehension, he reflected on how completely the galaxy had changed since a 12-year-old human girl named Sarah Chen had died alone aboard a crystalline ship. The chamber itself looked the same curved amphitheater, the same carefully arranged seating that reflected each species' political standing. But the dynamics had shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. Where once the Zephyrian delegation had held court at the center of attention, they now occupied a smaller section with the wary posture of beings who had learned that their technology did not make them invulnerable. At the podium stood Admiral Elena Vasquez, no longer the quiet xenobiologist who had once represented humanity's diplomatic interests with careful deference. She wore the dark blue uniform of the Terran Defense Force, her shoulders bearing the insignia of someone who commanded fleets that had reshaped the balance of galactic power through 3 years of relentless warfare. "The motion before us today," Elena announced, her voice carrying none of the harmonic manipulation that Zephyrians used, but somehow compelling attention through sheer force of conviction, concerns the establishment of the Galactic Protection Protocols, specifically designed to prevent the systematic abuse of member species by those who believe superior technology grants them unlimited authority over others. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, but they were different from the reluctant agreement that had once greeted Zephyrian pronouncements. Now they carried notes of genuine debate, heated discussion, and the kind of political engagement that had been absent from council proceedings for centuries. The transformation had not happened overnight. The destruction of research station Kepler 442c had triggered a series of events that exposed the extent of Zephyrian manipulation throughout galactic civilization. As news of Sarah Chen's murder spread, other species began coming forward with their own stories of mysterious accidents, unexplained equipment failures, and the systematic suppression of any voice that challenged the existing order. The human response had been swift, methodical, and utterly without mercy. Unlike other galactic militaries that relied on elegant weapons and sophisticated tactics, humanity approached warfare with the practical mindset of a species that had spent millennia learning how to kill each other efficiently. Their converted civilian ships became platforms for weapons that ignored established conventions about appropriate force levels and targeting protocols. More troubling still, from the perspective of established powers, was humanity's talent for asymmetric warfare. When Zephyrian fleets moved to crush human colonies, they found themselves facing not grand naval battles, but coordinated campaigns of sabotage, terrorism, and technological disruption that turned their own advanced systems against them. Human engineers, working with salvaged Zephyrian technology, and their species' disturbing gift for reverse engineering anything they could get their hands on, had developed countermeasures that neutralized many of the Empire's key advantages. Phase-shift drives that had once allowed Zephyrian ships to pass through most defenses suddenly found themselves trapped in quantum interference fields. Energy weapons that could disrupt matter at the molecular level were rendered useless by adaptive armor that learned from each attack. But the most significant change had been political rather than technological. The death of Sarah Chen had provided other oppressed species with something they had lacked for centuries, proof that the Zephyrians could bleed, and an example of a species willing to risk everything rather than accept injustice. The Bavari Confederation has experienced firsthand what happens when dissent is met with systematic retaliation, Thokmer had testified before the special tribunal that investigated Zephyrian war crimes. For 50 cycles, we accepted reduced trade opportunities, equipment failures, and terrorist attacks as unfortunate coincidences rather than risk open confrontation. The humans showed us that resistance was possible. Similar testimonies had come from dozens of other species, painting a picture of an empire that maintained control through fear and plausible deniability. The Zephyrians had never needed to conquer their enemies when they could simply make resistance seem futile and cooperation seem like the only path to survival. That illusion had been shattered in the burning wreckage of their enforcement squadrons, and with it had collapsed 3 centuries of carefully maintained political control. Species that had never dared to voice opposition suddenly found their courage, forming alliances and mutual defense pacts that excluded Zephyrian participation. Trade routes were rerouted to bypass their controlled territories, and their advanced technology became less valuable as other species learned to develop alternatives. "The delegate from the Zephyrian Empire wishes to respond," Elena announced, her tone professionally neutral despite the history of violence between their species. Ambassador Kethvar rose slowly, his crystalline form noticeably dimmed compared to his former radiant confidence. The being who had once commanded attention through harmonic manipulation and implied threats now spoke with the careful tone of someone who knew his words would be scrutinized for any hint of the old arrogance. "The Zephyrian Empire acknowledges the tragic events that occurred at Research Station Kepler 442c, he began, his voice lacking the compelling undertones that had once made other species feel compelled to agree with him. "We have conducted extensive internal investigations and implemented new protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future." It was a far cry from the casual dismissal of human concerns that had characterized their response immediately after Sarah's death. Then, they had claimed that the child's demise was an unfortunate accident resulting from human ignorance of advanced technology. They had suggested that grief was clouding human judgment and that rational beings would accept the inevitable tragedies, that occurred when primitive species attempted to interact with their betters. The subsequent war had taught them the dangers of underestimating human grief and the fury it could generate when channeled through military planning and industrial capacity. Admiral Mitchell's first fleet had been converted civilian ships crewed by volunteers on what was essentially a suicide mission. By the war's end, humanity fielded battle groups that could stand toe-to-toe with any force in known space, their weapons and tactics refined through years of combat against supposedly superior enemies. "Protocol amendments are insufficient," declared Ambassador Sithrak of the Qatari Collective, her insected features clicking with agitation. "The systematic abuse documented by the tribunal requires fundamental changes to how galactic civilization operates. The Galactic Protection Protocols represent a new foundation for interspecies relations, one based on law rather than the whims of technological supremacists." Elena nodded approvingly. The Qatari had been among the most oppressed species under Zephyrian dominance, their hive-mind decision-making process making them easy targets for the kind of psychological manipulation that the Empire had perfected. Their newfound willingness to speak publicly against their former oppressors represented one of the most significant political shifts in the galaxy. "The proposed protocols," Elena continued, "establish clear guidelines for intervention when any member species faces systematic oppression, regardless of the technological capabilities of the aggressor. They create enforcement mechanisms that operate independently of existing power structures, and they guarantee safe haven for refugees fleeing persecution." The protocols represented 3 years of careful diplomatic work, building coalitions and establishing legal frameworks that would prevent any single species from dominating galactic civilization through technological superiority. They were modeled partly on human concepts of international law and partly on the hard lessons learned during the war against the Zephyrian Empire. More importantly, they were backed by military force that could not be ignored or dismissed. The human defense fleet had grown from Admiral Mitchell's desperate volunteers into a professional military organization that maintained bases throughout the galaxy. Their ships were no longer converted civilian vessels, but purpose-built warships designed by engineers who had learned their trade fighting against seemingly impossible odds. "The human approach to warfare lacks elegance," one military analyst had observed in a widely circulated report. "They do not seek to defeat their enemies so much as to break them completely. Their weapons are crude but effective, their tactics are unrefined but successful, and their strategic thinking appears to be based on the assumption that any conflict will continue until one side or the other is completely destroyed." It was an assessment that made other species nervous, even those who had benefited from human protection during the war. Humanity's rapid transition from peaceful explorers to galactic military power suggested a capacity for violence that was at odds with their stated commitment to justice and cooperation. But for Elena, standing at the podium where she had once been dismissed as a naive idealist, the transformation represented something more profound than military conquest. It represented the emergence of a species that refused to accept that might made right, that technology determined morality, or that the strong had any inherent right to dominate the weak. "The final vote on the Galactic Protection Protocols will take place tomorrow," she announced. "Until then, the Chamber recognizes the right of all member species to present their positions and concerns." As the formal session concluded, Elena found herself approached by the same being who had warned her years ago about the dangers of opposing Zephyrian power. Ambassador Thokmer's massive form still bore the scars of his species' warrior past, but his expression carried something that had been absent from their previous conversation: hope. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, using her old title despite her military rank, "my people have asked me to express their gratitude for what humanity has accomplished. You have given us back something we thought was lost forever." "What's that?" "The right to say no," Thokmer replied simply. "For centuries, we lived in fear that resistance would bring retaliation, that speaking truth would result in mysterious accidents and equipment failures. Your species showed us that bullies remain bullies only as long as no one is willing to fight back." Elena nodded, thinking about the cost of that lesson. The war had claimed millions of lives across dozens of star systems, including the 36 humans who had died at Research Station Kepler 442c rather than submit to alien tyranny. Admiral Mitchell herself had been killed during the final battle for the Zephyrian homeworld, her ship ramming through their planetary defenses to deliver a message that could not be ignored or misunderstood. But their sacrifice had purchased something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization based on law rather than fear, cooperation rather than domination, and the principle that no species' technology gave them the right to murder children with impunity. The Zephyrians still control advanced technology, Thokmer observed. Their ships can still phase through most defenses, their weapons can still disrupt matter at the molecular level. What prevents them from simply waiting until attention turns elsewhere and resuming their old practices? Elena smiled grimly. Because we're watching them, because we've shown that their technology doesn't make them untouchable, and because every species in the galaxy now knows what happens when humans discover that their children have been murdered by beings who think themselves above justice. She gestured toward the tactical,